I was going to say good day to you, but I think I can safely say good afternoon. Welcome to the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza for our first daytime book launch event. This is a new venture for us as we're coming out of the confines and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is our intent to steadily build dynamic programs with historians, scholars, and community leaders in this intimate and accessible space. We are extremely honored to welcome and present one of Dallas's leading presidential and public historians today. How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents, is a truly fascinating read. It is a timely and thought-provoking book about presidential leadership. I don't like this mic. And how some of the greatest presidents have handled crises, how they've made decisions, faced the consequences of their actions, how they learned, who do they have around them as advisors, how they were perceived in the press and by the public during their time in office, and how over time their legacies have stood the test of time. Or not. There are highly relevant questions posited to engage the reader after each of the 8 chapters, inviting readers to determine how the leadership qualities of these presidents can be applied directly to the reader's own life and their leadership aspirations. Of course, it's the chapter exploring President Kennedy's short life and legacy that will focus our time today, and we look very much forward to an active Q&A session afterwards. We're so grateful to Talmage for his unique insights in delving into riveting aspects of presidential leadership. And we thank you all so much for coming here today, and we hope that you'll mark your calendars for Friday, June the 14th, which is Flag Day, where Talmage Boston will be engaging Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin in another conversation similar to this one today. So please join me in thanking Talmage Boston.
Good afternoon, Dallas friends. So glad you could be here, this wonderful museum. I didn't realize this was the inaugural program, but I'm glad to be a part of it. And hopefully they'll have many more to come. I hope you'll come back on June the 14th when I have the honor of interviewing Doris Kearns Goodwin on her wonderful new book that came out a couple of weeks ago. I'm guessing that you're here for one reason, and that is because you love history. Now, there are some low brows from the great unwashed who from time to time ask questions like, what good is history? And my answer is, well, I think there's 2 reasons. Number 1, it shows us how much things change. Number 2, it shows us how much things stay the same. And sometimes history can actually be applied to our daily living. And that's my goal this afternoon, showing you 2 ways in which, because things have stayed the same, they can therefore be applied by you and me to our lives. Now, as Nicola mentioned, my new book is titled How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. It came out a month ago. It's a combined leadership / presidential history book. And it covers the most important leadership traits of, in my not so humble opinion, our 8 greatest presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. Now, the book's target audience is you, anybody who is or aspires to be a leader in any field. And in researching the strengths of our 8 greatest presidents, I realized that they all had one thing in common, and that is they were all great persuaders, although they each went about the business of persuading in his own unique way. So exactly how they succeeded as being effective persuaders in leading our nation to new heights during their eras, I believe is worthy of our attention this afternoon, because after all, we're all in the persuasion business. So with that in mind, let's turn to the presidents, see what it was that made them great persuaders, and hopefully use that knowledge to help us raise our game in our fields of endeavor. First great president, George Washington. Now, as far as public persuasion went, George Washington was not a great public speaker. Long before there were microphones, he struggled because he had a soft, breathy voice that was a result of a childhood respiratory illness, so he couldn't beam with this resonant voice to the multitudes. He couldn't do that. In addition, you probably heard through the years, he had serious issues with his teeth, such that by the time he was president of the United States, he only had one tooth remaining in his head. And so he had to wear these unbelievably bulky, unwieldy dentures. If you ever go to the museum at Mount Vernon, they're on display. And you can't believe how anybody could have that in his mouth and be able to speak. It's like speaking through a small bird cage. And yet, despite the voice and the teeth issues, what he said was persuasive. So how could that be? Well, first of all, he was amazingly accomplished. If you meet somebody who's incredibly accomplished, you're going to pay more attention to them. You're going to hear what they had to say. You're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. You're going to respect them. And by the time he became president, obviously Washington had been recognized as a hero for his battlefield courage in the French and Indian War, where he'd had horses shot out from under him, bullet holes in his hats, in his uniforms. And so people were well aware of that military record from the French and Indian War. And then, of course, it was followed shortly thereafter by his great leadership of the colonial army in the American Revolution, an 8-year revolution. People don't realize how long it took. And he stayed the course the entire 8 years. And then also, from a political standpoint, he was the presiding chairman of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, which of course had resulted in a constitution that everybody from all over the country could agree upon, and then he was part of the effort that caused it to be ratified. So he'd had a number of very notable achievements before he became president that would cause whatever he said for people to pay attention to him and be persuaded by. But obviously it took more than that. And so what was it? If it wasn't his voice, what was it that caused people to give their trust to him, to want to follow him? Well, one of the things he had was a commanding presence. He was 6'2", which meant he was usually the tallest guy in the room. It'd be like being 6'9" today. But in addition, he had ramrod straight posture. He always wore immaculate dress, whether it was his military uniform or whatever he was wearing to attend any type of meetings or gathering, always A+ perfect in his attire. He always rode a white horse. Whenever he moved, walking, riding, he moved with athletic grace. And so you put all of these traits together and he epitomized command presence. He walked into a room, you couldn't help but notice him and be impressed by him. But beyond that, besides the mere strength of his appearance, he had absolute integrity, unwavering integrity. You remember the old Parson Weems fable when he was a kid? He chopped down the cherry tree and had to say, "Dad, I'm sorry, I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree." Well, that was a fable, but Parson Weems was trying to make a point, so he created a metaphor. And that was, from the time he was born, this was a man who could not tell a lie. He was not going to sugarcoat the truth or anything else. You could take his words to the bank. And that's another reason to be persuasive, when people know that they can trust you. And then last but not least, he had a very rare trait for politicians, and that is he not only knew when to speak, he knew when not to speak. Now, here he was, the first president. The great experiment had begun, and George Washington's top priority was, I got to maintain unity. And it didn't take long into his first term before all of a sudden the unity started to go away, and ultimately two competing political parties were formed. One became the Federalist Party, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. the other, what became known as the Republican Party, which ultimately evolved into today's Democratic Party, but in those days it was called the Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so with each passing week, there became competing newspapers, some Federalist-oriented, some Republican-oriented, constant conflict among the media of the day, constant conflict of the politicians of the day. And Washington, with his number one goal being to be the unifier, knew that if he started taking sides, then that was going to be disruptive to his goal of unity. And so his practice was to let others talk first. He had penetrating eye contact with whoever was speaking. The portrait artist Gilbert Stuart, who painted his portrait many times, said, "You look in George Washington's eyes and you see the eyes of the fiercest warrior in the jungle." So if you're talking and George Washington's looking at you with those eyes, you feel like you're being listened to, you feel like you want to be on your best behavior. And one of Washington's other great traits, he was a great decision maker, in large part because he was willing to listen to both sides. During his presidency, Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, would often be in conflict with Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State. And rather than try to listen to them and then decide, Washington's practice was to require them to each prepare competing memoranda of their position and submit them to him, and he would read them and reflect on them and finally make a decision. But everyone knew he was giving thorough attention to both sides of the issues. So sometimes by staying above the fray, not being the first person to speak, knowing when not to speak until the end and in a way that presents a unifying message, that's what great leaders do, staying above the fray. So George Washington, a great persuader because he had notch in the belt accomplishments, a command presence, total credibility, and because he knew what it took to be a good listener and speaker. Second great president, Thomas Jefferson. Now, like Washington, Jefferson knew he was not a good public speaker. In fact, this was one of the most interesting things I learned in the research for the book. During his 8-year presidency, Thomas Jefferson gave a grand total of 2 speeches. The only 2 speeches he gave were his inaugural addresses. And though, as you know, persuasion comes in many ways. Sometimes it's in the form of powerful oratory to the multitudes, but a lot of times persuasion is up close and personal, small groups, one-on-one. That was Thomas Jefferson's specialty, and he knew it. So keep in mind, here he is, day one of his presidency. He's succeeding John Adams. John Adams had been a Federalist. During his presidency, Congress had been led by a Federalist majority, and during that time, the Congress passed what was called the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize President Adams or any Federalist policy. People were being thrown in jail for exercising their First Amendment rights of free speech and free the press. That's what happened during Adams' presidency. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired by its own terms at the end of Adams' presidency. So here's Jefferson on the first day of his presidency giving the first of what would only be 2 speeches in his inaugural address, knowing that if this fracture continued, the country wouldn't last. And so his opening words were to the effect, look, folks, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, i.e. we are all Americans, and we better start acting that way or else this country isn't going to make it. But then to bring the people together, knowing he wasn't a great speaker, he embarked on a series of dinners. And I don't mean once a month or once every 3 months. He had 2 to 3 dinners every single week of his 8-year presidency. And he would invite Federalists and he would invite Republicans. He had one rule: we're not going to talk about the hot button issues. We're going to talk about music, literature, history, what we do for a living, what our families are. In other words, we're going to talk about the things that people talk about when they're trying to be friends. And over the time, of course, it didn't happen on the first dinner, the second dinner, the 5th dinner, but over time the walls started coming down. People realized that it's absolutely possible to have political differences with someone and still be able to like him as a friend. There are two adages that I hear a lot today that certainly apply to Jefferson's attitude toward how to persuade. Number one, politics is all about relationships. If you have great relationships, somebody's going to be willing to work with you. Even if the outset he disagrees, let's find a way to make something work. And secondly, if somebody likes you, then he's most of the time going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And if he doesn't like you, he won't. Jefferson knew this. He was the master conversationalist. He was the master of charm in small groups. And so over time, these frequent dinner discussions among people with different political agendas turned into a conversation among friends. And the walls started coming down, which made him the master of the personal relationship side of political persuasion. In his Thomas Jefferson biography, John Meacham said that at his dinners, the president's, quote, social civility, grace, and hospitality softened the strident partisanship as feelings evolved from hostility to at least partial respect. So Thomas Jefferson, a great persuader, as a relentless relationship builder. Third great president, Abraham Lincoln. Now, most people agree Lincoln was our most eloquent president. So how did he get to be so eloquent, given that he had less than 1 year of formal schooling? He didn't complete grade school or high school or college or law school, put all of his schooling together, less than 1 year. How did he get to be so eloquent? Well, there were three things that he did throughout his life, and particularly his adult life, that got him in a position of becoming truly eloquent. Number one, as a child, he was a voracious reader. And living where he did, there weren't that many books out there, but the books that were out there were great. And so he read them over and over again. He had a photographic memory, and so he would memorize large chunks of them. And so the books I'm talking about are Aesop's Fables, Shakespeare's plays, the King James Bibles, and the classic poets. The second thing Lincoln did as a means of frequent, almost daily activity was he was a very successful trial and appellate lawyer. When you're in that business, which is what I've been in for almost 46 years, you got to know which words to use to which audience in order to persuade them to go your way. You speak differently to a jury than you do to a justice or an appellate court, than you do to a client, than you do to an opposing counsel. Lincoln got that and knew that he couldn't use the same approach in dealing with the many different groups that he dealt with as a lawyer. And then third, beginning at the age of 23, Abe Lincoln was running for political office basically his whole adult life, meaning that he was constantly giving speeches to crowds, and for him, practice made perfect. So these three word power foundations from his years as a reader of great works, a lawyer, and a politician caused Lincoln to hone his skills, become more eloquent, become more effective as a persuader for the last 35 years of his life. So what exactly were the skills that he finally concluded would make him the great persuader as president? Well, there were 5 word power traits that he followed that made him such a persuasive leader. First, he was obsessed with word precision. Now, I suspect many here went to school, and somewhere along the line you encountered Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, which has 8 magic words in it. Of course, the first Strunk and White's came out more than 50 years after Lincoln died. So these points which they concluded were actually the points that Lincoln had already mastered in his lifetime. The 8 words: eliminate unnecessary words, say exactly what you mean. And Lincoln was the master. In his speeches, there was never one unnecessary word. The Gettysburg Address had 270 words in it. That's less than half the size of a standard newspaper editorial. Not a wasted word. These are the words that our children and grandchildren have been memorizing ever since they were uttered in 1863. It took him 2.5 minutes to deliver, but every word loaded with meaning. His second inaugural address called by some his most eloquent speech, the one that ends with malice toward none, with charity for all. 702 words. Took him 5.5 minutes to deliver. So not one unnecessary word, and absolute clarity. And so how do you do that? You don't get that on the first draft or the third draft or the 8th draft. You only get to that point after rounds and rounds and rounds of tight editing until every word is loaded with meaning and there's no unnecessary words. That was Lincoln's approach to crafting his most important persuasive speeches. The second trait, like Washington, he never misstated or overstated anything. Remember his nickname? Honest Abe. You could take what he said to the bank. The third trait, he built rapport with his audiences by using wit and telling stories. People like to smile. People like to laugh. People like to hear good stories. Remember what I said about Jefferson? If somebody likes you, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Wit and storytelling skills cause people to make you more appealing. Fourth, when it came time in his speeches to hit the persuasion climax, he spoke with an impassioned, earnest tone. You saw that in the Lincoln movie, the way Daniel Day-Lewis portrayed himself in those key scenes. But Lincoln said, "I'll never get emotional." He thought that was manipulative. He thought that was ultimately dishonest. So he didn't let his passion or his earnestness cross the line to becoming emotional. And then fifth and last, and this to me may be the most important of all these traits, he made sure his words had rhythm. Remember how the Gettysburg Address ends? This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And this government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Rhythm. Many of you have read the books of David McCullough. David told me that every time he finishes the final version of a chapter in any of his books, he would come into his living room, he would have his beloved wife, Rosalie, sit down and read the chapter aloud to him so that he could satisfy himself that his words in the page had the desired rhythm. So Lincoln, a great persuader because he maximized his word power by framing his words to match those of the great writers he had read as a child, by speaking the language of whoever was in his audience, by serious editing that removed all unnecessary words and created absolute clarity, and by making sure that his words always had a rhythm to them. Fourth great president, Theodore Roosevelt. I'm sure many of you remember it was TR who coined the phrase that anybody who gets elected President of the United States thereby has the power of the bully pulpit. And though Roosevelt spoke to crowds often from that bully pulpit, he was not a particularly great public speaker. You may have seen newsreels of him. He spoke almost with a machine gun-like cadence. He was not like Lincoln. He didn't have the rhythm. He was big teeth, fast-spoken words. And so for the most part, what he said in his speeches is largely forgotten. But he did have a powerful persuasion tool in his toolkit, and that was up close and personal when it came time to mediate disputes. Now, many of you know and have been involved in mediations, but for those who haven't, basically it's when two parties who are at war in today's society, typically two parties who are on opposite sides of a lawsuit and can't resolve their differences, and so a neutral comes in, who's the mediator, and his job is not to say who wins, who loses, who's right, who's wrong. His job is to develop a conversation with both sides, brainstorm new and possible ideas that might be the basis of common ground that will lead to settlement and resolution. That's what a mediator does, and that was Theodore Roosevelt's most effective persuasion skill. He'd been president for 1 year, and there was a national coal strike. All the coal miners went on strike against the coal company owners, and it went on and on and on for 6 months with no progress being made. And Roosevelt knew that no American president had ever gotten involved in a labor dispute before, but he knew he was president, somebody had to do something or half the country was going to freeze to death. when the cold weather came. So he brought the parties in, dialogue, brainstorming, leaning on both sides, developing rapport with both sides, and lo and behold, they agreed to binding arbitration, which brought an end to the strike, and nobody froze to death. A couple of years went by. Japan and Russia were at war with each other, had no idea how to bring an end to the war, thought, well, maybe Theodore Roosevelt can do for us what he did for the coal industry. And he did. And for it, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. A couple years later, another dispute in Morocco. A couple years later, another at the Hague Convention. This was Theodore Roosevelt's strength. In her biography of Roosevelt titled The Bully Pulpit, here's how Doris Kearns Goodwin described his power as a mediator. Quote, he used his unusual powers of concentration, his rich cadre of ideas, and his ruthless single-mindedness, together with warmth, unabashed intensity, and pluck of personality to move people toward settlement. And so Theodore Roosevelt, a great persuader, as a focused, shrewd, and emotionally intelligent mediator. Fifth great president, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, FDR was persuasive because he mastered two ways of great public speaking. First, powerful oratory with snap, crackle, and pop delivery when he spoke to the large crowds. But secondly, he also had a calm conversational style, which he used on his in his fireside chats on the radio. Now, as an example of his powerful oratory, day one of his presidency, his first inaugural address, the country's totally bogged down in the Great Depression, so many people homeless, so many people hungry, been going on for years, no end in sight. And Roosevelt stepped up and said, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It made people stop and think, maybe that is all we have to fear. Above all, we know we have a fearless president who's going to take this Great Depression head on. It was a great start to his presidency. But another one of his great public oratory speeches came the day after the bombing on Pearl Harbor. Here were his opening words. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. We will not only defend ourselves to the utmost, we'll make certain that this form of treachery will never happen again. It made Americans want to step up, join the war effort, defeat the despicable enemy right now. But besides this commanding oratory, which he pulled out from time to time, he also persuaded people with his gentle conversational delivery in his fireside chats on the radio. 7 days into his presidency, Roosevelt, because there was this national panic and run on the banks, the fears of the Great Depression, Roosevelt closed all the banks. He called it a bank holiday. And the next day, the 8th day of his presidency, he gave his first fireside chat. And in it, he explained in a matter-of-fact way, here's what's been done the last day, here's why it was done, and here's what we're going to do going forward. His reassuring words caused an immediate turnaround in America's attitude toward the banking situation, such that the next day all the banks reopened and there was no panic. The run had ended. But for both of these persuasion, both the oratory and the radio, he was so successful because he knew what the people were thinking. If you ever want to persuade anybody, you better know what his or her starting point is. What are they thinking now? And then I got to think about how to way to move it to what I want them to think. And so FDR went way beyond any predecessor in doing what it took to know what the public was thinking. Among other things, he held frequent press conferences. Don't you wish we had those today? With a president who was unafraid of any question from any reporter, from any side. He wanted to hear what was on everybody's mind. He also, to the extent he could, with his polio, he canvassed the country and on car and train trips, always in a listening mode. Beyond that, his wife Eleanor, who was on the road all the time throughout his presidency, would come back to Washington and report, here's what the people are thinking in Arizona, in Michigan, in Rhode Island. He also stayed on top of the newly developing industry of public opinion polls. And finally, he always wanted to be in the business of hearing what the leaders of both political parties had to say. So once what FDR knew what the people, all the people were thinking, which was often different from what he thought they should be thinking, he then moved them his way by making his comments move incrementally, one step at a time, so that people could process them, grasp them, cause them to resonate, reverberate, and ultimately penetrate. And this was especially true in the way he moved America during the late 30s and early 40s, when Hitler was pursuing his reign of terror across Europe. Now, at the beginning of Hitler's aggression, most Americans were stuck in a mindset of isolationism. They didn't want to go halfway around the world and fight in a war. They'd done that 20 years before in World War I. They didn't want to do it again, and FDR knew that. So he knew he was going to have to move them off of that position, because he knew from his conversations with Churchill and other leaders, Hitler wasn't going to stop. Hitler was going to pursue and take over Europe and ultimately potentially Asia, Africa, Australia, the high seas, unless a nation with the power of the United States chose to get involved to bring a stop to him. So that's where the people need to go, and yet they're stuck in isolationism. How do you move them? Well, it was a series of fireside chats. For one, he would say to the people, this is not a statement about war. It's a statement about national security. That sounds a whole lot less threatening. You can process that better, particularly when you're anti-war. But national security is something we kind of always want to have. Later in another chat, he told the country, quote, the war is now approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war knows that it is stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. Now, how could anyone possibly argue with that? And so his words moved strategically, one step at a time, so people could process his thoughts, reflect on them, and then be ready for the next fireside chat where he'd move them a little farther toward where they ultimately needed to be, had the desired effect. That's how persuasion works best. Knowing your group's sentiment and speaking in a way that moves it at a pace that people can grasp it, process it, and ultimately thinking about changing their position. So FDR, a persuader who knew when to speak with vigor, when to speak calmly, and how to gauge and change public sentiment. Sixth great president, Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not a great public speaker like Washington and Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt, and yet today's leading historians for the last many years have said Eisenhower is our fifth greatest president, behind Lincoln, Washington, and both Roosevelts. So why do they think he was such a great president? Because they realized that once Dwight Eisenhower set his sights on achieving a goal, he knew how to persuade people to get there, and he got them there. In particular, in order to persuade people on how best for things to move toward achieving the goal, he knew when to be patient, and he knew when and how to play hardball when someone was getting in his way. Look at how he directed D-Day. Remember, he patiently waited for the weather to change, and then he played hardball with the Normandy invasion. On his desk in the Oval Office was a saying that epitomized his style of leadership, quote, gently in manner, strongly in deed. An example of his exercising patience to accomplish his objective was his handling of Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare, which had carried over into the start of Ike's presidency. Many told him, including people like Harry Truman, you got to attack McCarthy directly. You got to go right at him. That's what Truman had done, and it had absolutely no success. Eisenhower was smarter than that, was more strategic than that, was more patient than that, and so he crafted a hidden hand behind-the-scenes plan that ultimately gave McCarthy enough rope to hang himself, which he did in the Army McCarthy hearings, and that head-to-head battle was led by the Army's lawyer Joseph Welch, and Eisenhower never had to get his hands dirty. Eisenhower, throughout the entire first year of his presidency, when McCarthyism was at its height, refused to say McCarthy's name in public. So by being patient, a plan, slow but sure, steady, that achieved its goal, that's how he handled McCarthyism. Now, an example of his knowing when and how to play hardball came right before the election for his second term in October 1956. America's allies, England, France, and Israel, had joined together, invaded Egypt, and seized the Suez Canal. And they had done it even though Eisenhower had said to them, don't do that. That's going to disrupt the balance of power in the Cold War. That's going to screw up the Middle East. Don't do that, and they did it anyway. Well, when Eisenhower saw what they had done and violated what he thought had been their commitment to follow his advice, he went into action immediately. He immediately obtained United Nations sanctions against all three countries. Next, they came begging to him, we need an alternative source for oil. He said, not from the United States, you're not getting it. And then finally, he refused to provide the dollars needed to stabilize the British pound, which was in free fall. So that did result in a ceasefire, but in the ceasefire, the Brits in particular refused to withdraw their troops. So Eisenhower made a run on the British pound and then called the British Prime Minister and said, if you don't get your troops out of the Suez immediately, I, Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, will drive your pound down to zero. That's what you call hardball. Those British troops were out of the Suez Canal in a nanosecond. So Dwight Eisenhower, a great persuader because he knew when to be patient and when and how to play hardball. Seventh great president, John F. Kennedy. Here we are at the Sixth Floor Museum. A great persuader. Remember the 1960 presidential election? There were many Americans who thought we can't possibly have a Catholic president. And so that was one of Kennedy's first jobs as a persuader, to persuade people that that was okay. Remember, people with the stature of Norman Vincent Peale were saying we can't have a Catholic president whose loyalty will be to the Pope and not to the country. And so Kennedy gave a famous speech. He said, look, I fought for our country in World War II. My brother got killed for our country in World War II. We have every right to be president. And my loyalty is to this country. It's not to the Pope. He persuaded people. They believed in him, and he won that election. But then going forward, his first day in office, his famous 1961 inaugural address, when he urged Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And within a few weeks, he created the Peace Corps. And immediately there was a surge of young Americans who joined the Peace Corps and went abroad and did all kinds of great things to restore America's great image around the world, all in response to his words in the inaugural address. A year later, in his 1962 speech at Rice Stadium in Houston, with these words, he inspired national support for the American Moonshot program. Quote, we choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and we intend to win. And shortly thereafter, Congress upped the budget, agreed to increase the funding on the space program, and lo and behold, we did have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And then a year later, he persuaded Americans that it was important now to end Jim Crow and give civil rights to African Americans, because he said it's no longer a political issue, it's a moral issue. It all came to a head in the summer of 1963. Now, all historians recognize that for the first 2 years of his presidency, JFK basically did nothing as far as advancing civil rights. He did that because, like virtually every presidential predecessor, on day 2 in office, he's already thinking about, how am I going to win a second term? And he knew that to win a second term, he was going to have to keep the southern United States, the Southern Democrats, who, of course, were all in favor of Jim Crow. So to enhance the likelihood of being elected to a second term, the first 2 years he did nothing. But then along came 1963. And in particular in April were the Birmingham riots, where Sheriff Bull Connor unleashed fire hose blasts on black children and unleashed vicious attack dogs on black adults. And it was all on national television, and Kennedy saw it, and he was sickened. And if days passed and nothing was getting better, nothing would get better, finally the straw that broke the camel's back in his mind was when Governor George Wallace blocked the doors to entry to the University of Alabama for any black students. That night, Kennedy gave a nationally televised address that was largely spontaneous. Here's what he said, quote, "We face a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increased demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is time to act in the Congress, in our state and local legislative bodies, and above all, in our daily lives. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all." And a few days later, he offered a strong civil rights bill to Congress and was moving toward getting it passed when, unfortunately, he was assassinated. But fortunately, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, had the legislative wherewithal to get it passed. It became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So how did John F. Kennedy how was he so persuasive on the issue of a Catholic president, on the issue of national service and the Peace Corps, the space race and the moonshot program, and civil rights? Well, his biographer, Stephen Knott, says the key to his success was that his words always appealed to the better angels of our nature. Those magic words from Lincoln's first inaugural address. Kennedy's words never appealed to the dark side like so many of today's politicians use. So John Kennedy, a great persuader, because he knew the hearts and minds of Americans, and that if something needed to be done, it could be done if our focus would always be on doing the right thing. Eighth and last great president, Ronald Reagan, who entered the White House when America was in serious decline. You remember the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter, double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gas lines, and we couldn't get our hostages released from Iran. America was in a state of national malaise during the Carter presidency, and we needed somebody to turn us around, somebody to lift us up, somebody to get us to rethink and re-embrace the concept of American exceptionalism, and that person was Ronald Reagan. He repeatedly said to the nation with contagious conviction, "We're here to do whatever it takes. America should be a shining city on a hill. My strategy for the Cold War, we win, they lose." On his Oval Office desk, words inscribed, "It can," all caps C-A-N, "it can be done." And it was that kind of optimism that never wavered and on which he followed through that brought an end to the Cold War, revived the American economy, and restored America's self-confidence. Pessimists don't move mountains. Only optimists move mountains, and Reagan's presidency proved that. So Ronald Reagan, a a persuader with the power to inspire optimism and follow through on it with sincerity and constancy. So there you have it, my Dallas friends. May you remember how our greatest presidents used their unique styles of persuasion to achieve success. George Washington, persuasion as an accomplished command presence with unwavering integrity and who knew when and when not to speak to maintain unity. Jefferson, persuasion as a relentless relationship builder. Lincoln, persuasion by maximizing word power through clarity, sincerity, and precision. Theodore Roosevelt, persuasion as a mediator with the power to find common ground between conflicting factions. FDR, persuasion by knowing when to speak with vigor and when to speak calmly and knowing what the public sentiment was and how to change it incrementally. Eisenhower, persuasion by knowing when to be patient and when and how to play hardball. Kennedy, persuasion by inspiring us to be guided by the better angels of our nature. And Reagan, persuasion driven by constant, sincere optimism. So now that you know the history behind how the best did it, may you use what you've heard today to enhance your leadership persuasion repertoire. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Why was Truman
Okay, good question. How did I choose my 8 and why was Truman excluded? My choices are largely tied to the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll. Every time a president leaves the White House and a new one comes in, C-SPAN does a poll of the country's 150 leading historians and asks them to rank all of our presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential leadership traits. And the last 2 times that we've done that poll, 2017, when Obama left the White House and Trump came in, 2021, when Trump left the White House and Biden came in, the results of the C-SPAN poll for the top 9 were identical. 1 Lincoln, 2 Washington, 3 FDR, 4 Theodore Roosevelt, 5 Eisenhower, 6 Truman, 7 Jefferson, 8 Kennedy, and 9 Reagan. I made the decision to take Truman out because I think he's overrated. He got us into Korea and had no idea how to get us out. It took Eisenhower to find a way quickly to get out with a truce within 6 months. McCarthyism reared its ugly head in Truman's presidency. He had no idea how to get rid of it. Eisenhower, as I talked about, got rid of it. Truman gets a certain amount of credit for dropping the bombs and bringing a prompt end to World War II. My friend Evan Thomas has a wonderful new book that came out a few months ago, Days of Surrender. There's no way Truman wasn't going to drop the bombs after all the time and money that had been spent on the Manhattan Project. And if we didn't drop the bombs, then we were going to have to invade Japan and lose hundreds of thousands of lives. There's no way in the world those bombs weren't going to be dropped. So I think Truman is largely overrated, and I think Reagan is underrated, as H.W. Brands says. For what FDR was to the United States the first half of the 20th century, Reagan was to the second half. And Richard Reeves says what FDR was to liberals, Reagan was to conservatives, game-changing in every respect. But I also think that in 2024, more people are interested in reading about Reagan than they are in Truman. But last and not least, I'm trying to sell my book to Democrats and Republicans. And so I wanted to have a good balance in the modern era. So in the modern era, 2 great Democratic presidents, FDR and JFK, 2 great Republican presidents, Eisenhower and Reagan. And I also want to make the statement that in this horrible, polarized political situation that we've been in for quite some time, I want Democrats to understand and appreciate we've had great Republican presidents. And I want Republicans to recognize and appreciate we've had great Democratic presidents. And that's a message that I think is important. So that was the reason why I chose the 8 I chose. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you. This was tremendously good for me. I've been sort of an amateur presidential historian since I was a kid. I spent several years in elected office, and what I found was a lot of this helped me. a lot of this helped me be successful. I was mayor in Mesquite during the pandemic and the racial strife, and it was an awful time to be in public office. But even though this helped me, what I also learned was, in addition to the awful pessimism that we live in today, both liberals and conservatives, where just nothing is good, I see more and more that, whether it be local or state or national, less and less people that want to run for public office have never read anything about any of these guys, or of a Speaker of the House, or of anyone who's ever served in public office in our nation's history, and it's hurting us.
No doubt. No doubt. And, you know, people ask me kind of, what do all these presidents, their leadership traits have to do with presidential politics in 2024? And I said, there's not a whole lot of connection between my 8 and our last 2 presidents. And all I can hope for is that regardless of who wins in November, that somehow in the next 4 years the country will survive, and that these 2 guys will get pushed off the national stage forever and ever, and that we'll have a new wave of young leaders who have the capacity to have the courage to run for political office, but also to demonstrate the traits of our greatest presidents. So I appreciate your willingness to be in public office, and also your frustration with seeing today's current political scene and why it causes so many otherwise very capable leaders of industry or any other organizations to be reluctant to enter politics. Yes, sir.
You spoke generally about how each of these...
I want to give you a microphone.
You spoke generally about how each of these presidents were able to persuade the public. Which of them do you think was most successful in persuading Congress to enact legislation?
Well, I think Jefferson, with his relationship building approach, was extremely effective in that respect. But Eisenhower, in fact, for these 8 presidents, besides the fact that they were all great persuaders, in my opinion, they also had the same approach to presidential leadership, and that was, if you're going to be effective, you've got to direct your efforts on the middle way, is what Eisenhower called it. You can't be focused on the extreme right or the extreme left. And so anybody who's not focused on that middle way is not going to be successful. And so each of these were largely successful. John F. Kennedy was working with Republicans. Reagan crossed the aisle to get important legislation passed. His relationship with Tip O'Neill across the aisle was famously very productive. So that's part of being a great leader, is keeping your eye on where most people are, and that's typically and that's almost always, maybe always, in the middle. And that's the problem we have with politics today, that because of the nature of the primary system, if you run in a Republican primary today and you want to win, you better be on the far right. Similarly on the Democrat. If you want to win, you better be toward the left. And that's why 70% of the American people in all the polls today say they don't want Trump or Biden. And so that's what we're living in today, and hopefully future leaders with lots of these traits and the horsepower to help us think through how to solve these problems will get things turned around. But for right now in 2024, there's not a whole lot to be optimistic about, except to bet that as over the course of our history, throughout our history, great leaders from time to time arise and get us through these very difficult problems, whether it be slavery, etc., isolationism, all these things that I've talked about, McCarthyism. Great leaders do arise. We never know when, we never know who it's going to be in advance, but they do get the country turned around, and it's ultimately about being able to persuade. And that means persuade not only the people who are on your side, but on the other side.
Talmage, thank you.
Well, Joe, sure.
How were you guided by other historians as you wrote this book?
My approach to writing this book, since I'm still a full-time lawyer, is, and have been for 46 years, I don't have time to go to the presidential library and dig out the handwritten letters in cursive writing that are hard to read. I don't have time to do it, and I don't need to do it, because there's so many prior historians who have done that and who have written great biographies of each of these presidents. tons of them, dozens of them. In Lincoln's case, 16,000 of them. So my approach was, for each of these 8 presidents, I read the leading biographies, plural, of each of them, typically 6 to 8 of the leading biographies of each. Again, focusing my efforts, what does this biographer believe were this president's most important leadership traits? And they were largely in agreement. There wasn't a whole lot of conflict. And so that was how I decided on the average 3 leadership traits per president that caused him to be successful. But then, to check myself, when the chapter was completed, I would then submit that chapter to at least 2 major biographers of that president and say, did I miss something? Did I misstate something? Do you agree with my conclusions? And so I got feedback from at least 2 major, and these are all set out in the acknowledgement section of the book. So in other words, I feel like my conclusions were thoroughly vetted, and I have confidence in them. And if you look at the back of the dust jacket, you see that one of those 2 leading biographers endorsed the book on the dust jacket. David Stewart for George Washington, Pulitzer winner Nanette Gordon Reed for Thomas Jefferson, Ronald White, who's written 4 best-selling books on Lincoln for Lincoln, Doug Brinkley for Theodore Roosevelt, Doris Kearns Goodwin for Franklin Roosevelt, Evan Thomas for Eisenhower, Mark Updegrove for Kennedy, and William Bowdoin for Reagan. So I feel like that vetting and the reaction by them, which were largely, we agree with you, we don't think you missed anything, we don't think you misstated anything, makes me feel like my process was valid and that my conclusions are good, even though I didn't bury myself in the old handwritten letters in the presidential libraries. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Since we're here, with Kennedy, I noticed you didn't mention the missile crisis, and I was just wondering why. And I know some people think maybe he was too dangerous there or not, but where you come out on that. And secondly, I was wondering what you thought might have happened with Vietnam. There seems to be arguments either way that he would have pulled out or that he would have, people have argued that either way. So how do you feel about those 2 and why not the missile crisis?
Well, the book covers the missile crisis. As I mentioned, each chapter contains an average of 3 leadership traits that caused that president to be successful. And not all of them are tied to the theme of the speech I just gave on persuasion. So the first trait that for Kennedy that I talk about was how he grew in office. That here was a guy who had spent 14 years in the U.S. House and the Senate and was totally unaccomplished. Didn't put through any significant legislation, wasn't involved in foreign policy except to be an outsider looking in and being critical of Eisenhower, claiming there was a missile gap, claiming we were behind the Russians in the space race, which turned out to be totally false. And then he's handsome, he's telegenic, he's great on TV, the debates are great, and he gets elected president. And so all of a sudden he says, oh my gosh, I'm president, what do I do now? He'd never thought about having an economic policy or fiscal policy. So he immediately surrounded himself with the country's leading economic thinkers, people like Walter Helen and others who became his council of economic advisors. And he was an incredibly brilliant, Kennedy, brilliant guy, quick study, mastered the materials, extended dialogue with all these thinkers, and within a couple of years, he had changed his economic perspective, become Keynesian, advocated tax cuts, revived the American economy, which for the last 2 years of Eisenhower's presidency had been stagnant. So that was area number 1, where incredibly quick and effective growth in office vis-a-vis economic and fiscal policy. Area number 2 was foreign policy. He had come in and inaugurated January 1961. 3 months later, we have the Bay of Pigs fiasco. He made the mistake of relying on so-called military experts who assured him that the guerrillas who'd been trained in Guatemala and Nicaragua would go over to Cuba. There were 1,500 of them. They'd go over to Cuba, and because they were in the right and because most of the Cuban people were believed to be anti-Castro, that the Cuban people would immediately rise up and join forces with the 1,500 guerrillas, and they would change everything. Well, that was false, because Castro had this army of 25,000 soldiers who immediately put down 1,500 guerrillas, and it was a total international embarrassment. Kennedy, to his credit, took credit for, hey, I'm the commander-in-chief, it's my fault, I screwed up, we never should have done this, it was flawed from the beginning. He proceeded to fire his head of the CIA, Allen Dulles. But from that point on, his foreign policy, he learned from that mistake. You don't knee-jerk accept the advice of so-called experts. That caused him a few months later to decide not to send troops into Laos. And most importantly, as you say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the way he managed it, all these military leaders were saying, we got to bomb Cuba, we got to invade Cuba. He said, no, we don't. And he kept his own counsel. And also, the second main leadership trait that I talk about in the chapter is the ability to remain calm in a crisis. And I talk extensively about how he stayed calm in the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, made the right decisions, and this calmness is verified by the fact that the 42 hours of meetings during the 13 days that he had with his executive committee and joint chiefs of staff reflected that as with each passing day, more and more people were getting hysterical and wanting more and more drastic action, and there was one cool head in the room, and it was President John F. Kennedy. And then the third leadership trait was his capacity to turn words into deeds, which is what I did talk about in the speech, in terms of how it's one thing to be eloquent, it's something else for your eloquence to actually inspire people to do things. And that was his special gift. Some people may say, well, wasn't Ted Sorensen and Dick Goodwin, weren't they the ones writing the speech? Kennedy had the last word, a serious editor, and it's one thing to have the right words on the page. It's something else to be able to deliver them with the conviction that inspires people, and that was one of Kennedy's special gifts. So those were the three traits, and so I thoroughly talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis in the chapter, but also come to appreciate he was our youngest elected president at age 43. Theodore Roosevelt had become president at age 42 after McKinley was shot. But here he is, this young elected president. He's inexperienced, and in a matter of very little time, he takes command of the situation and was well on his way to being reelected for a second term and potentially taking America to new heights when unfortunately he was assassinated. So even though he was president for less than 3 years, our leading historians rate him as the 8th greatest president. That's unbelievable that somebody with that short a time could be that recognized by people who are in the business of knowing what they're talking about. You got another question?
A brief follow-up to this gentleman's question regarding presidents dealing with Congress, and to touch on both his and your responses. From reading books like yours over the years, I've learned that great leaders know how to sometimes put their egos and their personal feelings aside. Well, David Gergen wrote a great book about his years as communications director under Reagan, and Reagan could deliver great, meaty, conservative speeches of a right-wing agenda, if you will, but then he put more moderate Republicans in charge of dealing with an all-Democratic Congress, and as you said, that got a lot of stuff done. We could use more of that.
Well, there are so many right-wingers these days who view compromise as a dirty word, which shows their idiocy. Reagan was the ultimate compromiser. And James Baker, who was with him all 8 years of his presidency, first term White House Chief of Staff, second term Secretary of the Treasury, every time I talk to Secretary Baker, and I've interviewed him 4 times, since been with him many times, he says, in every conversation he brings up that Reagan would always say, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than to wave the flag jumping over the cliff. I mean, he got it. And that's what great presidents and great successful politicians do. They realize, no, you're not going to get 100%, and if you don't get 100%, it doesn't mean that you're a rhino. It means you're an effective politician who actually succeeds in getting things done. And that's what great presidents do. Yes, Betsy.
I work a lot with teenagers, young children, And I wonder, do you feel like our schools are doing enough to promote compromise, inclusiveness? I mean, I
One
worry.
thing I can tell you, our schools are not doing enough in the way of teaching history. My friend Ken Burns, who wrote the foreword to my last book, says the reason why most people don't love history is because when they took it in high school, they can always, they never remember the last name of their high school history teacher, but they remember his first name, and it was Coach.
Yeah, Coach.
And most history is taught by coaches who are not exactly serious scholars. And last week, my wife Claire and I were in San Francisco and learned that right now at Stanford University, you know, one of the most prestigious universities in the country right now, in the undergraduate program, there are 17 history majors. They're not studying history. So I think there's all kinds of instruction about inclusiveness and all this kind of stuff, which is kind of touchy-feely good stuff and presumably is therapeutic. But per my speech and per my perspective on life, it's kind of nice to know what really happened and what people really did, and particularly to try to discern the great things that people did and think about how can I embody them. One thing I have not mentioned thus far, and that is that my friend Mark Updegrove, who wrote a wonderful biography on John F. Kennedy, when I was starting out on the book and I sent him my idea in my first chapter, he said, you cannot put these 8 people on pedestals. In each chapter, you've got to have a section where you address the fact that they had flaws and what their flaws were. And so toward the end of each of my chapter, there is a section on that president's major flaws, just to show, there were issues there. But the real thrust is obviously what did they do right as opposed to what did they do wrong. But then, as Nicholas said in the introduction, at the very end of each chapter, I have a series of questions for the reader to ask him or herself, how am I doing in these particular traits in the chapter that I've just read about? How am I doing in inspiring optimism throughout my organization? How am I doing at building consensus when there's conflicting factions within my organization? How am I doing at knowing when and how to play hardball when it's appropriate? So the idea is that there'll be this interactive component for the reader as the ultimate goal to be a better leader, not by knowing your history, but more importantly, knowing how to apply your history. That's where I wish we had more of an emphasis in our schools today than the touchy-feely inclusiveness stuff. We got one. Yes, Deborah.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I always feel like I'm improving my incomplete education when I come to one of your lectures. And
Thank you.
This is my weekend read now. I wanted to ask you with regard to the 8 we watched, you went through them in chronological order. And it wasn't lost on me that the media has begun playing a larger and larger role, not only in who leads, but who's selected. And I wondered if you would speak to how we could possibly interject some optimism back into the media, because I personally feel they're driving most of the pessimism that we're
Well,
seeing.
media has always been influential, and that goes back to
Sure.
George Washington and Thomas Jefferson's days, and there were dozens and sometimes hundreds of newspapers with competing perspectives. And then, of course, there's always people on both sides of the political aisle who've been on the radio and now television, the expanded cable channels and so forth, and now social media. And the thing about these great presidents is they identified exactly what the media of his era was and how to best deal with it and put himself in the best possible position. So obviously in a 24/7, 365 news cycle with all kinds of social media, to try to get your arms around how best to deal with that and allow your perspective ultimately come through is a challenge. But it's a challenge that all presidents have had to deal with, just with different levels of media that have changed over time. So just as people learned how to master the radio, learned how to master television, again, per my answer a few minutes ago, I'm going to be optimistic that the really smart people who surround themselves with smart people are going to be able to come up with ways to effectively communicate their message and not have it distorted and nullified by an always vicious media, because the media has always been vicious. Sandra.
This may be a little bit off the subject, but
I'm a history buff. I have always followed history. One of the biggest criticisms that I hear about studying history, especially in the more advanced education, is what do I do with it when I get out of school? How can I apply this to a job or influencing people in the future?
Well, that's always a good question. And I mean, you could say history, you could say literature, you could say liberal arts, because it's all basically tied in together. And all that knowing history and knowing literature allows anybody to do is how to think clearer and hopefully how to communicate ideas more effectively, whether they decide ultimately to enter into the business world. I think anybody who is a history major or an English major realizes, what are you going to do with that? Well, you can go to law school. In some cases, you can go to medical school and other graduate schools. And so the only thing you can, quote, do with this, you want to be a professor? Well, that's a very successful life for a lot of people. It's typically not going to be a great paying job to support a family for most people unless you get to the highest levels at the top universities. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be in the business of education, and it doesn't mean that by learning how to think clearly and communicate clearly and read the great writers and the great thinkers, to recognize that is going to impact my ability to be a business leader or any other type of leader. So just because it's not directly tied to future employment, and my wife and I have 2 kids, we didn't want them necessarily be English or history majors. We wanted to be able to get jobs. But our son in particular is a great student of history, and he knows how to use it and how to apply it. And that's really what the book tries to do, is to take these historical facts and make people stop and think about, I can apply this to what I'm trying to do in leading a business or a nonprofit or a museum or a television station or whatever it might be. That this is an essential part of education, just like reading, writing, arithmetic, every bit as important, in my opinion, as the 3 R's. And just because it's not going to immediately be tied to future employment doesn't mean that people shouldn't study it for a long time and closely with the idea that it's going to change their life for the better. Maybe not directly tied to employment and pay scales, but in leading to a richer, fuller life of being able to express yourself and connect with a wider group of people.
One last question. Could you do the quote where if you don't learn about history, you are condemned to repeat it?
Santayama, that's a very, that those who refuse to learn about history are condemned to repeat it. And that's a related quote that came from Mark Twain that Ken Burns likes to cite is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so circumstances are always going to change. There's always going to be different factors, but nonetheless, there are enough things that hopefully you've heard in this presentation that you can compare it maybe to something with what your company's dealing with now or something that our city is dealing with now or what have it, that you can see some parallels that can allow you to think through things from a different and clearer perspective than if you didn't have it. Okay, I think thank you for being such a good audience.
I'd just like to say thank you so much, Talmage, for this really insightful discussion. I hope all of you will read this book carefully. History does matter, and it's not boring. It's how we learn about each other and our journey through the course of our life on Earth. I know that sounds trite, but we're in a really serious, perilous situation these days where it's not being taught in the schools and there's absolute lack of curiosity. So this book, I hope, will be an awakening for all people. And also part of our mission at the Sixth Floor Museum is to tell the story of President Kennedy's life, his assassination and legacy within the context of presidential history. This is ongoing and evolving, so I am so indebted to you for including President Kennedy in this book and for helping start a new conversation on this historic site about presidential history.
And let me say, everybody got a sack with a book in it, and I'm happy to sign your copy of the book. I'll be sitting right up here afterwards. Thank you.